Hello, welcome. My name is Christy Patton. I'm counselor to President Linda Mills and also professor. My academic home is NYU Steinhardt, so it's great to see some of my old friends from NYU Steinhardt here. But I want to welcome you to the second community event of NYU in Dialogue, which is designed to grow our capacity to listen, to learn, and to value different perspectives. I have to put my glasses on for this part because I want to be exact. I want to start my introduction with a count of days. 730 days, or exactly 2 years ago today, on March 12th, 2022, it was day 17 of 20 days in Mariupol, where now Academy Award-winning Ukrainian journalists from the Associated Press were rescued from the hospital that was under siege by the Russians as they were firing on innocent civilians. Thanks. They abandoned the city in order to get the images and the stories out. It has been 346 days since the brutal civil war in Sudan broke out April 15th, 2023, leaving thousands dead with an estimated 19 million children out of school. It has been 157 days from the Hamas terrorist attack on innocent civilians at a music show and in quiet neighborhoods in southern Israel, where hostages were taken and are still being held in Gaza. And as I speak, the days are still being counted, with Palestinians hungry, suffering, and dying in Gaza as the fighting continues. I am not a political scientist, nor do I have any background in human rights, conflict, or peace building. But I am a developmental therapist, and the through line through all of these is the suffering of innocent civilians, many who are or were children, and the cries for peace from these civilians. How do we talk about peace with injustices and conflict so prevalent? Where do we start? How do we as a community come together during these difficult times and find a path forward? Tonight, we're going to start by listening to experts here at NYU who have spent their professional lives examining issues of human rights, conflict, peace building, and use of media to distort and amplify these conflicts and peace around the world. Each brings unique perspectives, expertise to the table for what we hope is an engaging and insightful conversation. And I could not think of a better person to moderate this discussion than Dr. Elisabeth King. Before I turn it over to Elisabeth, I want to mention 2 housekeeping items. Each of you has a note card and pen on your seat. If you have questions throughout the talk, please feel free to write it down on the note card and raise your hand. A staff member will come collect your card, and we will collect all cards by 6:50 p.m. Also, as you've already seen, NYU Campus Safety is doing a test of their emergency notification system. It has nothing to do with talking about peace and conflict, and rest assured, all is well. Now it is my honor to introduce our esteemed moderator and one of NYU's leading experts in peace building who will introduce the panel. Dr. Elisabeth King is Vice Dean for Faculty Affairs, Professor of International Education and Politics at New York University, and founding director of NYU's Interdisciplinary Minor in Peace and Conflict Studies. Her research focuses on building inclusive identities and institutions in ethnically diverse and conflict-affected contexts. She is author with fellow panelists, Cyrus, Samii, of Diversity, Violence, and Recognition, How Recognizing Ethnic Identity Promotes Peace, winner of the 2022 Best Book Award from the International Studies Association, and also the author of From Classrooms to Conflict in Rwanda. She has conducted fieldwork in Kenya, Liberia, the Philippines, and Rwanda, among others. She has consulted for organizations including UNICEF, USAID, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and the MasterCard Foundation, with special expertise in post-conflict peace building, education in conflict-affected context, and community-driven development. Please join me in welcoming Elisabeth.
Thank you, friends. When I saw Christy's paper, I asked her, isn't that a little bit long? I'm really grateful to be here this evening and part of this NYU Dialogues series, where we get to listen to different perspectives and to learn how to talk about different topics. And when I was invited to lead this panel about conflict and peace, I recognized it as a tremendous honor and responsibility. And I'm really delighted to be able to welcome my co-panelists with me this evening and all of you who've decided to join us. So the goals for this evening, as we've set them out, are first of all for our audience to learn something. You don't have to, and you probably won't agree with everything, but therein lies the opportunity. And just as I start all of my classes with an invitation that you leave with more questions than you came in with, or that you leave more unsure of a position than when you'd entered, I'd ask that you also start this conversation with some of those goals in mind. So we're going to get at the issues of peace and conflict this evening by, first of all, tackling current events. But we're also going to be learning from our academic research, how we learn about conflict, what scholarship can teach us about peace building, and also as faculty, the experience of teaching and learning about peace and conflict on a university campus today. So I'll kind of give you part of the ending at the beginning. And that is to say that in all of my classes, I find that a key takeaway is about nuance and complexity. So you're going to find that this is not a story about good guys and bad guys or about two sides. It's a story that is nuanced, complex, academically challenging, methodologically challenging, and emotionally difficult also. Because we're talking about conflict, and even in thinking about the numbers that Christy presented, we're talking about real people who find themselves in situations that most of us find even difficult to imagine. So it's with that I'm especially grateful to the four friends and colleagues who have joined me this evening. First of all, to my left, your right, Michael Posner is Professor of Ethics and Finance at NYU's Stern School of Business. He's also the director of the Center for Business and Human Rights at the school, which is the first ever human rights center at a business school. Prior to joining us at NYU Stern, Mike served in the Obama administration from 2009 to 2013 as Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. And I said to Mike, in addition to all the expertise that he brings, he's probably the most experienced at having these bright lights. Beside Mike, we have Joshua Tucker, Professor of Politics, also Director of NYU's Jordan Center for Advanced Study of Russia. And he's an affiliated professor of Russian and Slavic Studies and Data Science. He's also co-founder and co-director of the NYU Center for Social Media and Politics. And Joshua originally studied mass political behavior in post-communist countries, but more recently his research has focused on the intersection really between social media and politics. So we're equally delighted to have you this evening. Cyrus Samii, beside him, Christy already told you, my co-author, associate professor in the Department of Politics. Cyrus is an expert on the design of quantitative field research and social science randomized controlled trials, with research focused on testing strategies to address governance challenges in conflict-affected context. So I would summarize a lot of your work, Cyrus, as looking at, does what we think might work to build peace actually work? And we'll be asking you some questions about that this evening. And not last, other than alphabetically, is James Wahutu, all the way to my left, Assistant Professor of Media, Culture, and Communication, also at NYU Steinhardt. James studies the sociology of knowledge and sociology of media with an emphasis on genocide, mass violence, and ethnicity in sub-Saharan Africa. He does really fascinating work in Kenya, Sudan, and Rwanda, where I've also done a lot of work. And he's a proud affiliate of NYU's minor in Peace and Conflict Studies, and he's faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. So you can also see some themes beginning to emerge amongst our panelists' expertise. So without further ado, and with gratitude, those of you who have just joined, warm welcome. I'm going to start with current events. I think I want to acknowledge, though, too, that all of the questions that I'm asking could themselves be entire panels. Right? So we are just beginning to get into some of these issues. And I think, Mike, a natural place to start is Israel and Palestine. So you've been invited to speak with a number of student groups, faculty, community groups. What can you say about where we're at right now with Israel and Gaza? What's happening at this moment?
So first of all, thanks, Elisabeth, for having me as part of this. I think it's fair to say that there are a number of things I'm not going to be able to say in 3 to 5 minutes, but let me offer 3 observations that maybe set the stage for the discussion of Israel and Gaza. One is that there are two badly traumatized populations. If you talk to Israelis or their supporters, their friends, what happened 5 months ago feels like it happened 5 days ago or 5 minutes ago. There's a collective despair, really, about the October 7th attack, the fact that it was so brutal, the fact that it was so deliberate in terms of targeting civilians just because of their religion, their nationality. And so it's hard for Israelis to think beyond their own trauma, which is still, as I say, very raw. On the other side, the Palestinians in Gaza and their families, supporters, friends are watching every day as the humanitarian crisis becomes more acute. You have 30,000 people who've died, 70,000 injured. Many people.
I think we're being asked to speak into the microphone
sorry.
a little more. Thanks, Mike.
Almost 2 million people displaced from their homes, and a real danger that there's going to be even more suffering and more desperation in terms of food security and the like. There's a humanitarian disaster really in the middle of that. And again, Palestinians are totally absorbed in this. So when Israelis talk about October 7th, it doesn't register. When Israelis are so absorbed in October 7th that what's happening in Gaza doesn't register. So that's point one. Second point related to that, a good friend of mine, political scientist who passed away a decade ago, Stan Cohn, was a professor at London School of Economics, human rights activist. He lived in Israel for a while, originally from South Africa. He wrote a wonderful book called States of Denial. And he basically describes the phenomenon psychologically, emotionally, of people in stress, in trauma, having such a difficult time dealing with the things that are happening in front of them, that they ought to be seeing clearly. And so again, it ties into the first point. You have two communities that are isolated, two communities that are not, at this moment, able to experience the fears, the anxiety, the desperation, the anger, the desperation about the future that both communities face. They're both in denial, they're both emotionally traumatized, and it makes it so extraordinarily difficult to have a conversation, a rational conversation, even a conversation where people can differ because there is this wall that's gone up. Third point, and this is my last point, we've seen on this campus people using the slogan, I don't like slogans, but the slogan from the river to the sea. That refers to the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. The only fact to me that really matters and that will define the future of this and how we move beyond it is that there are 14 million people living between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. 7 million of them are Israeli Jews. 7 million of them are Palestinians. And they're not going anywhere. And so however you define it, we can talk about the history, we can talk about two states, whatever, all of the things that get discussed. But the essential fact is that there are 14 million people sharing a tiny place on earth, and they're not going anywhere. And we have to find a way collectively to make sure that both communities have a sustainable future that's based on peace and prosperity.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. And you covered so much in even just this short answer. And the reminder of the microphone reminded me also to welcome those of you who are watching on the live stream. Thank you also for joining us. Mike, in your answer, and before I turn to Josh with a new question, I wonder if you could tell us, so you began to say some people are maybe talking about a two-state solution. Can we talk about peace when we're in this context where you're talking about denial and emotional trauma? Like, what are the prospects here?
Well, we can talk about anything we want. That's a different question than are the two communities ready to sit down and have a constructive discussion about the future. And I would say not now. You need to, first of all, get beyond the immediate crisis the humanitarian crisis, etc. You need for both communities to be in a better place psychologically, emotionally, to begin to think about this as, our side versus their side. We win, they lose, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. We're not there yet, and you need leadership. You need leadership across the board. Peace doesn't occur as an accident. It occurs because there are people in each community who have the vision, the foresight, the courage to basically say, we have to give up something. Mm-hmm. And right now, both on the Israeli side and the Palestinian side, that's just not happening. So I think, we should talk about it. We should be prepared. We should be thinking about what the future might hold. But we need to have some patience also to allow both the leadership and the psychological moment to be right so people can actually have that discussion.
Right. Thank you very much. Mike, I'm going to turn from Israel and Palestine, in keeping with current events, though, to Joshua. As Christy noted, February marked 2 years since Russia invaded Ukraine. And I wonder if I may pose a similar question. Really, where are we at now? And maybe I could say, what are expert observers saying is likely to happen in terms of what that might mean for an eventual end of that conflict?
Great. Thank you so much, Elisabeth. Thanks all of you for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I'm honored to be on this panel with folks who have such expertise in this area, and I'll try to add a little bit here I can in context. But it's just it's an honor to be here. So where are we now? I think the first and most crucial thing we have to remember when we ask that question about Ukraine is there is still a war. Ukraine is still under occupation. It is still being bombed, shelled, invaded. Just because it may have occupied the front page of our newspapers and the first story on CNN for 2 months, and now it's gone away, the war has not gone away for the people who are experiencing it. It is still raging 2 years on, and there is no end in sight. So that's the first and most important thing to take out of this. This war is just as brutal, just as violent, and it is just as horrible as when it started. Where are we now from a kind of analyst-expert consultation? There's been multiple phases of this war. This war started with what was supposed to be Russia's romp to victory, much like in the conflict against Georgia. Famously, Russian soldiers packed their dress uniforms because they were going to have a parade in Kiev. There was a big surprise in the beginning of the war where this was unsuccessful. Russian plans kind of fell apart. There was stagnation. There was a second phase where Ukraine, after having held this territory, actually managed to push Russia back quite a bit, much more than expected. We then hit a winter. Things stagnated. After that winter, there was this long period of time where there was this buildup to the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which was supposed to build on this kind of first triumph of this. There's been an ongoing question about what types of weapons and aid would be delivered to Ukrainians. The Ukrainian counteroffensive did not go as well as was expected. We have now come out of another winter period, and in this period of time, we have seen that as Russia continues to throw human lives at the problem over and over again, and seems to have no lack of capacity for throwing human lives at the problem, that in general, things are not going particularly well on the battlefield for the Ukrainian side. And the major question has become, will the United States provide more support to Ukraine? And this kind of goes back and forth between Western allies in Europe and between the United States. Aid for Ukraine, which, let's be very clear, is supported by a majority of members of the US Congress, has gotten held up in US politics, and that is having real world consequences for Ukrainians. We get much discussion about whether it's sufficient, do the Europeans need to step up and do more? Do the Americans need to step up and do more? But it is clear that Ukrainians have fought heroically, bravely. They have thrown everything they have at this, but they need help from the outside world to continue the fight. Now, to the more difficult question of, where are we going? What happens next? What are the chances of, the chances for this conflict coming to an end? My take on this is that you want to think, and in order to understand how you think the conflict might come to an end, in some ways, you need a theory of why you think the conflict started in the first place. And there are a lot of different explanations that are out there for why the conflict started in the first place. If you parse all the different explanations that were thrown out there by the Russians and by Putin at the beginning of the conflict, there are words about Russia's feeling of its security being threatened. and the question of whether it saw this as one last opportunity to avoid long-term encirclement by NATO, and that Ukraine was moving closer to the West, et cetera, et cetera. That's one particular story that's out there. If that's the case, it's a very difficult problem to solve, but we kind of know how to solve security guarantees, right? We have many centuries and decades of making peace that involves dealing with powers' security concerns. So that's one potential explanation. If you think that that's really why it started, then there may be ways that this could end where these security guarantees are put in a place where it becomes more costly to Russian security to continue fighting than it does to stop fighting. Mm-hmm. But that's a big if, because there are other reasons why this war may have started. If you listen to other of Putin's words, in particular where he said originally that the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest tragedy of the 20th century, which is saying something given tragedies that took place in the 20th century, then, and you listen to, if you did listen to his history lesson that he gave to Tucker Carlson recently, and many, many words of his in between, there's also a story where Putin, as the aging dictator who has been in power for this long period of time, one thing we know about aging dictators is they sometimes tend to think about their legacies, and we also know they tend to get lousy advice from people after they've been in power for so long. That if we think of Putin as the aging dictator, he may have in this that this is part of his legacy. And part of his legacy is either going to be, there's a couple different ways to come to the same point here. One is you need to right the wrong of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. So he is embarking on a project to start righting that wrong. Another, if you listen to the history lesson, is that he seems to have become, compelled by this idea that there is no separate existence of a Ukrainian nationality, and that there is a part of sort of Russia's role in this region to bring people under the control of Russia. If either of these are the explanations, that this is really about the lack of existence of Ukraine, then it becomes much, much harder to envision the way you get a peaceful or you get a negotiated end to this war. Mm-hmm. Then this war gets won by somebody. Either the Russians get pushed out of Ukraine or the Russians eventually accomplish their goal. There's a third explanation here too, which in my work, I tend to work in comparative politics, which is the politics of politics within countries. And a third explanation for why this war started is that the very existence of Ukrainian democracy was a threat to Putinism, the regime that Putin had installed in Russia. And I'm running short on time, so I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but I'm happy to talk more about it during Q&A. But by this manner, one of the reasons that one might think this war began is that Russia needed to show that the Ukrainian experiment could not succeed as an alternative that would be available for Russians to look to Ukraine as a potential alternate path forward. This leads to more complicated questions about what it might mean for the end of the war. But I'll close with just one thing, which I just want to remind everybody here. It's easy for us to talk about ending this war, but there is a fundamental point here, which is that if you are Ukrainian, your country is being occupied. Horrible things are happening to Ukrainians in the occupied territory. Saying simply, why don't we just end this war? Why don't we just stop fighting? Means something very different when we're on the other side of an ocean and we're counting up how much money has been spent on armaments than it does to people who are living in an occupied country and dealing with a power that is larger and that has shown itself time and time again throughout the centuries to be willing to move west, to be willing to move into these territories. So it is to close with the same thing Mike said, it is a very complicated, nuanced question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Joshua. And thinking about the way that we're talking about peace too, right? And reflecting on some of the questions that you submitted in advance, sometimes we think about peace more in the sense of a negative peace, right? Like a cessation of large-scale violence. Other times when we're talking about peace, we might be talking about, and this is classic sort of peace and conflict language, more of a positive peace, which goes further than a negative peace, which goes further than a ceasefire, and looks more broadly at the different types of societal conditions that need to be in place to prevent a recurrence of conflict. And there we're talking about not only security, but also political institutions, economic arrangements, justice. Some of you started asking about in your questions, reconciliation. I know, Cyrus, you have worked really all over the world. I have a list. let's see, Indonesia, Nepal, Colombia, Burundi, Liberia, Afghanistan, not exhaustive. I'm going to, maybe having put this, different conceptions of peace, and us having begun to talk about current conflicts and challenges to peace building, what have you learned in your studies about what ultimately works for building peace?
Great. Thanks very much, Elisabeth. Thanks, everybody, for joining. As Josh said, it's an honor to be up here. A lot of the research that I do is about testing intervention strategies to try and promote some sort of goal and using sort of scientific methods to try to do that. In the context of peace building, I think the first thing that has to be acknowledged is that a lot of the work that I've done, a lot of the work in this area is either operating under the existence of some sort of political settlement, right? And so then the question becomes, all right, a political settlement has been achieved through a negotiation process, and now it's a matter of actually just, bringing it to life somehow, such that, it achieves the goals, the positive peace goals that Elisabeth was talking about. And so we operate under the context of a political framework where there's some sort of arrangement that has legitimacy, hopefully, that we can then, get behind and try and make work. So that's one way of thinking about, peace building that works under a political framework. But, the situations that we've been discussing now are situations of ongoing conflict. And so the question is, what sort of contribution could the type of work that, I'm involved in make in that? And there are things that we could try to study to understand, contributions that citizens could make, contributions that media institutions and other factors that contribute to political discourse can make toward pushing toward a political settlement, right? And so as far as that goes, there's a lot of research that looks at whether through media strategies or whether through people-to-people types of strategies, you can either affect attitudes, the way members of one group view another, correcting misperceptions, potentially addressing prejudices, and so on, with the idea being that you're potentially contributing to building a constituency for peace that, in a situation where democratic action or other types of people power can be useful, you could be making a contribution as far as that goes. And, there's research that's been done to show, and we could talk about it in the Q&A, about strategies that can be used to help to address prejudices and misperceptions insofar as those are relevant issues. Another side of that is not so much about trying to change people's attitudes or trying to change people's minds about out-group members or something like that, but rather among those who are interested in pursuing peace, helping to give them the resources and capacities to operate more effectively. So, the literature on trying to, address prejudice or misperceptions is oftentimes criticized for being research that's, sort of taking people who are already positively oriented toward peace and, just studying how attitudes might change marginally on the basis of some media intervention or something like that. So there's this criticism that, we're just looking at the effect of preaching to the choir, and how interesting is that, right? I think a counter to that is that a lot of this research is not just about, preaching to the choir and seeing, what sort of attitudinal responses they might have, but actually offering the choir, capacities and knowledge that they could use to then pursue the interests that they already possess more effectively. And so some of the research that I've done, including in the Israel-Palestine context, has been more along those lines. For those who are interested in contributing or working toward peace, what are things that they can do to operate more effectively in the democratic context in which they're operating? So that's on the side of trying to sort of cultivate or enable constituencies for peace. Once political frameworks are in place, and obviously in the two contexts that we've just been discussing, we're not there yet. There's a lot of work to be done. Negotiations happen, political frameworks are inked. There's a lot that's there on paper, but then we have all of this to try to deal with on the ground. A lot of the work that I've done has been about reintegrating former combatants into civilian life and integrating them into democratic political systems. So in most of the contexts that Elisabeth mentioned, I've actually worked directly with former combatants. They were gun-toting members of insurgent movements and things like that, and studied and worked on programs to try to facilitate their transition to civilian life. That's one example of a very challenging problem, but one that inevitably, has to be addressed if we can move from beyond this phase. We've moved from active fighting to the existence of a political settlement. Now we're trying to get on with development, with the growth of democratic institutions. That's an example of one of the very formidable challenges. And there's been research, again, we can go into detail later if there's interest in doing so, on how you can accomplish this, right, in ways that attend to some of the difficult justice issues that arise. I mean, programs that are giving benefits, and reinsertion assistance to former combatants are not oftentimes viewed very favorably by the rest of the citizenry, who's viewed them as being people who've inflicted, harm and devastation on their communities. The idea that they're sort of being rewarded now with this type of assistance, it's a difficult justice question. And so, those are some of the issues that we try and study, and we have some insight on how to pursue that. By kind of balancing, not just focusing on, for example, the economic side of things, but understanding the social basis of individuals' participation in conflict and finding ways to redirect that energy that motivated them, on more social basis than on material basis to join these insurgencies, for example, to get them to insert themselves into peaceful civilian life. So I'll leave it at there, and then happy to go into detail later.
Thank you, Cyrus. My question for James really builds on things that all three of you has said. Maybe most directly, Joshua had talked about what's on the front pages of newspapers, right? And that builds to on Cyrus's research, I think, James. So you, I know when we've been talking, talk about how what appears on the front pages is not neutral reporting, even in selecting what appears and in terms of how it's reported. What we learn from the press is selected, processed, filtered, and your work can help us learn more about that and how we digest our news about conflict and peace building. So tell us more about your work, about how journalists construct knowledge in these contexts. I know you've done work in South Sudan, which Christy mentioned also. What can you tell us, James?
Thanks. So I'm going to be a Debbie Downer, but I feel comfortable because of everything that's come before me. I won't be the most Debbie Downer on the panel, which is a nice change for the first time in a long time. I think I am yet to be in a country and talk to people about the news or their media, and everybody's happy about it. Regardless of where you go, everybody's always complaining, right? There's always something that the media is doing wrong, that the news does wrong. But it's funny also because everybody always talks about the media as that institution on that side that has nothing to do with the way we live our regular lives. We sometimes forget that journalists exist in our very own communities, and they write the stories and they frame the stories in a manner that makes them go, I know Cyrus exists because we've gone to dinner. These are the things Cyrus is thinking about, right? How would a Cyrus consume this information I'm producing about Russia, right? About Israel, about Palestine? And that then creates these moments where journalists operate almost as if they have blinkers in not just who they seek out as a source, but how they think about framing the narrative that the source is bringing in to kind of put their case forward. In the US, I normally tell students talk about this notion of objectivity as if it's a notion that has existed since journalism existed. Started around 1920s, 1920-something, right? Really new. And it was a business decision. It was this idea that we need to find people from both sides because we need to sell newspapers. right? That's where this notion of objectivity comes from. And it ends up being defined as a both sides sort of narrative. The danger with this, as we've seen over the last decade or so, is you end up giving bad actors a platform. And bad actors have realized that all they have to do is to make the most amount of noise, and the journalists will come looking for them because we assume that they have a relevant perspective. So the example I normally give students, if you put a climate scientist on a panel on CNN, and then you put a rabid climate denier on the same panel, the person that is going to win that conversation is the rabid climate denier because they are not dealing in facts. They don't have to care. A scientist has to do all of these gyrations, right? So the question then becomes, how do we navigate this space? How do we craft narratives that enable an American to look at what is happening in Ukraine and go, maybe there's a different way to understand what is happening and to push for different results if I'm not consistently thinking dollars and cents. As an American, I'm not consistently thinking, well, I'm a Republican and this is how I'm going to navigate this space. How do you craft that narrative? How do you change these perceptions? Well, we have examples in a lot of African countries where journalists realize very quickly that a both sides kind of approach to journalism, especially in the run-up to elections, was often going to be very detrimental. So they decided to engage in this thing that is now being called strategic silencing, right? And all of a sudden, we need to strategically silence some voices. And I often go, nothing that journalism does is new. Nothing, right? We can look at what journalism in other countries is doing and then think about ways in which to tell a different kind of story. But for that to happen, we also have to understand that journalism and the news are heavily, heavily socially constructed. They're heavily constructed and influenced by the societies within which journalists are immersed. So in October last year, I was at NYU Accra. And in NYU Accra, and in Accra generally, the conversation about Israel and Palestine was radically different. That was a conversation that was steeped in a history of colonization. So how they view the events that unfold October 7th is going to be radically different from the way an American appreciates it. The way a European journalist looks at what is happening in Israel and Palestine and thinks about it and frames it is going to be radically different. The way a German journalist talks about that story is going to be heavily influenced by the history of the Holocaust. And these things then mean that we may have these moments where we can actively think about, as Cyrus was saying, inserting different types of narratives and different types of actors that ensure that the narratives that are showing up are not necessarily inflammatory. What we have seen since October 7th has been, maybe because I teach media, in classrooms, students are even worried about looking at a story that shows up in Al Jazeera. And I've had to go, you have to look at Al Jazeera because Al Jazeera is owned in one way, shape, or form by the Qataris. And if they're involved in peace negotiations, you have to look at what that news organization is doing. Unfortunately, in the US, Al Jazeera is seen as the Bin Laden news channel, right? And that is how it has been smeared. So people look at those narratives radically different, right? And if we understand this, then we can move away from journalist X is, the phrase my students normally use is journalist X is racist. And I often go, well, no, they're working for a very specific type of institution that is immersed in a very specific society. So instead of looking at journalist X, we need to understand, why does news organization Y allow for these narratives to flourish? Well, then you look at where news organization Y is located. During the invasion of Ukraine, one of the journalists, CBS journalists, says, I cannot believe this is happening in a Western country where people are Christian and they watch Netflix, right? And people lost their minds that this was something that a journalist said. I said, well, who's the journalist that's saying it? And why is that the thing that they decided to latch on? Because they understand that for CBS audiences, Netflix means something. Being Christian means something. But you know the narratives we never heard of? of the African immigrants that were having a tough time even getting out of Kiev. Those narratives hardly ever showed up, apart from in African newspapers, in African news organizations, because for them, that is the story that was the most important one. So often we go, well, media X, and I go, well, no, they're a reflection of the society, which then means that they will code their narratives following very specific histories, very specific political realities. And as such, we need to understand the societies the news organizations are in to understand why certain narratives flourish and others do not. Because sometimes, as a non-American, watching CNN, watching MSNBC, watching Fox News in Nairobi, there isn't really a difference. Absolutely not. In the way those three organizations have, for example, talked about Haiti, right? As a non-American, it's the same thing. There was the former ambassador to Haiti said on a news organization the other day that, well, as much as Kenya wants to provide, and I know I love my country and I know politics, but as much as Kenya wants to provide the police to go into Haiti to enforce peace, those police officers and those troops have to be monitored by troops from Britain, Germany, or the UK or France. For those of you that may not realize why this may be annoying, 3 or 4 of those 4 countries are former imperial masters of the countries in the continent. What this ambassador said on a news briefing that he was being interviewed for was that the Africans cannot go in and do the thing in Haiti, not unless us Westerners are watching over them. And my first thought was, well, I didn't see the Westerners go into Mozambique, in Cabo Delgado. Those were not Westerners, right? We may be displeased with how RPF did it, but that was an African country. I have seen African soldiers in Darfur. They've been doing a fine job without Western countries. But these narratives exist, and that person was able to say that because they realize that for their audience, African countries mean something very specific.
James,
right?
I have to stop you.
Yes.
There's so much here to unpack, and I want to make sure that we're able still to get to a few more questions and also to get to a few questions from our audience. But it's so important what you're saying about how we're receiving news, digesting news, and I can almost hear in the audience the right? In reaching our goals of leaving with maybe more questions than you came in with. Josh, you work on social media. Are you able just briefly to speak to some of the threads that James has begun to raise? And social media is a place where we think about disinformation, misinformation, foreign influence, as those things relate to these topics of conflict and peace that we're talking about.
Yeah, I'll try to make a couple points briefly. I think the first point is the way I think about social media is that it radically decreased the cost of spreading information. If we think about a sort of pre-social media era, then everything you've been talking about in terms of like needing to be in the newspaper, needing to be on TV, right? That was what the gatekeeper was to getting information out there. So social media puts us in a position whereby this cost of spreading information potentially goes down. I mean, it goes down significantly. Now, for most people, you put something out on social media, it's going to be seen by a few of your friends and not many more people than that. And the question of who sees what on social media has become an absolutely huge question. This is all the debates about algorithms, right? But for some people, it gives them a much wider audience than they ever could have had previously. Now, whether that's good or bad for democracy, whether that's good or bad for autocrats, whether that's good or bad in these kind of conflict situations, that's an open question. Right, so it's not necessarily the case that what makes social media so interesting in this regard is that this same affordance, this ability to give voice to people who don't have access to mainstream media, can on the one hand benefit very progressive voices who are excluded from mainstream media in democracies. It can benefit democratic actors in authoritarian countries. But it can also benefit other autocratic actors in other would-be autocrats in authoritarian countries. And we've learned it also allows people who are it benefits people who are anti-democratic in democratic cases, in democratic countries. So the same thing that helps pro-democracy activists in an authoritarian country, these same affordances can help neo-Nazis in democratic countries. So coming back to your question of what this means in the case of misinformation, disinformation, foreign influence, I think there are a few things that are important to know. One is that when we think about warfare now, we have to think about warfare in terms of having a physical on-the-ground component. We also have to think of it having an informational component. That, though, is not new, right? There has always been an informational component to conflict, but it's different in a situation where you have these lower barriers to sharing information. When we talk about AI, which we haven't even got to on this panel yet, the way that I think about AI is the extent to which social media has lowered the barriers to sharing content. You still had to produce that content. AI lowers the barriers to producing content, but it does that for particular actors, and we can think about that in the context of peace and war in terms of particular actors that might benefit. One of the things AI is going to make it easier to do is to produce content in languages that are not your own. So when you come to this question of trying to insert information into discussions and insert information online in the context of conflict, right, we want to be aware that what may have been previously a barrier to producing content, even if sharing that content was easier, what's previously a barrier, that barrier is getting lower. It also points us to this big question about, you know, when we live in a world where there are a small number of platforms that have an inordinate amount of effect on what content people see, right? So it's no longer the newscasters, the media, right? Everybody can produce content, but who's controlling the algorithms becomes a huge question. And this becomes another front that opens in the case of conflict, where we see, the same way that we see in domestic politics claims that social media platforms are silencing certain voices. This is going to be a front of conflict. This is going to be a front in conflict too. And then I'll close with just sort of one plea, which is that what's a little bit different about this situation is that where you have these small numbers of platforms that are controlling access to information, we can think TikTok, we can think the Meta platforms, we can think Alphabet and things like YouTube. When this becomes a question in terms of global conflict, of whether voices on one side are being silenced to the other, when it becomes a question in terms of domestic politics, we're only going to know the answers to these questions if external actors who work outside the platforms, if external researchers are able to access data on these platforms. And so this is getting a little bit far from what we're here to talk about, but to the extent that you have questions about what's happening on those platforms, to the extent that the platforms can shut off outside access to this information when they want and open it up when they want, that makes it much harder for us as the mass public to be able to understand what's actually happening on them. So even in this particular case of how people make war and how information warfare gets in the way of peacemaking in the modern information era, this is yet another reason that we want to think seriously about whether we as a citizenry should be demanding from our political leadership that the data that is produced by these platforms is made accessible to outside researchers, or if the only people who can know what's happening on these platforms are people who work there.
Yeah, thank you. Josh, looking at the time, I think there's maybe one more topic that I would love to cover before we turn to audience questions. And that is, building on this idea that media is one of the places where we get our information about conflict and peace. We're also in this unique position where we're on a university campus, where we are faculty, we're students, we're staff, and this is a place where we get that information too, because this is a place where classes are happening, where conversations are happening. So I want to ask a couple of questions about that. And maybe I'll go to Cyrus first, and then I'll come to you, Mike, please. Cyrus, you teach a lot of courses related to conflict and to peace building, especially to undergraduates. So do you want to just share briefly sort of what some of the challenges are in leading these conversations that are often really difficult to have on current events with perhaps students that haven't had a lot of exposure to these issues before?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the ideas that I try to convey to students who are trying to study conflict, if they're interested in learning about peace negotiations or peace building, is that you have to be willing to go to some uncomfortable places. I mentioned in your mind. I mentioned that I've done a lot of work with former combatants, And one thing that I came to appreciate is that, a lot of the portrayals of what motivates combatants, whether they're soldiers in a regular army or members of an insurgent group or even a terrorist organization, the portrayals are oftentimes very simplistic and tend to point mostly toward material factors. But one thing that's been a constant, I would say, across all of the contexts in which I've worked, is that the combatants are oftentimes, they're usually pursuing what they're doing with a sense of purpose and righteousness, and that's something that you have to be able to understand. I would say, as a student in a classroom trying to understand a conflict, if you can't, I guess maybe wouldn't go so far as to empathize, but if you can't occupy that point of view, if you can't take that stance where you can recognize the purpose and the righteousness with which somebody is pursuing actions that may be atrocious in terms of their consequences, but if you can't occupy that position, you can't understand the conflict, because that's where the motivation is, right? It's not about people who are doing this because they're looking for a paycheck. It's not about people who are, motivated by, minor, concerns or anything like that. And that, if somebody could just dangle some sort of material incentive that you get them to change their mind, it's just not the way these dynamics work, right? And so to truly understand the dynamics that animate an intense conflict, you have to be able to put yourself in the mind and occupy the stance of somebody who is perhaps committing atrocious acts, but doing so with a sense of purpose and righteousness. And that's a difficult thing to do, but that's what we try and do in the classroom, right? We suspend a sense of trying to assign, who's the good guy and who's the bad guy. We first try and understand, right? It doesn't mean that we completely abandon, any moral commitments that we have or anything. But we're trying to pursue this, in a manner that leads to understanding, right? And then when we want to come back to our moral commitments, we use that understanding to try and think about productive avenues in that direction.
Yeah, thank you, Cyrus. When you were talking about explaining or understanding too, I think one of the things that I often confront in the classroom is that doesn't mean justifying, right? And that's something different, and that is part of these uncomfortable conversations, which is a perfect segue into perhaps an uncomfortable conversation of something that's come up a lot for you, Mike, when we were talking in some of the work that you've been doing around the campus. You had shared with me that you're sometimes asked whether you are pro-Israeli or pro-Palestinian, right? Did you want to talk to us about being asked that and what you answer?
Sure. I'm pro-Israeli and I'm pro-Palestinian, and I don't think that's a conflict. I have friends in Israel, I have friends in Gaza. And I have a sense of both communities, and again, coming back to where I started, everybody's losing. Mm-hmm. There are no winners. And we're still at a point where people are having a hard time understanding that there needs to be a way in which differences are discussed in an open way, an honest way. Doesn't mean agreement. Right. But how do you get to the place where you can begin to have that discussion about the future? I was thinking as you're asking that, I spent a lot of time in Northern Ireland in the 90s. And what brought people to the table was not, they had been immersed, Protestants and Catholics for a long time in a violent conflict, the Troubles. What brought them to the table was a common sense of opportunity brought by the European Union, which had started to invest. So London and Dublin became much less important. That brought them to the table. But at the end of the day, what made a difference in the peace process was that there was a willingness on the part of the British government to recognize that the policing had to change. All of these conflicts, at the end of the day, involve questions of security and how are people being treated in their daily lives. And the Royal Ulster Constabulary was not part of the solution, they were part of the problem. And so they created a policing commission under the Good Friday Agreement. but it was the external force of Europe that brought people to the table where they thought, okay, there's something in it for both communities.
Right.
And then when they got there, they had to deal with the tougher questions.
Thank you for that. Maybe just before turning to these questions, as I sort through them, James, do you want to take just 2 minutes? And I know this is hard. You just took a group of students to Rwanda, which is about to be in April, the 30th commemoration since the Rwandan genocide. And I had asked you, just in passing, how was this experience of taking J-term Abu Dhabi students to Rwanda? And you said, if I may paraphrase, intense, right? Do you want to say just a word?
Yes, intense. Intense because there's a difference between learning about these conflicts and these genocides in a classroom and being in Rwanda, interacting with Rwandans, but also going to genocide memorials, right? So that then means that for a lot of the students, this becomes a very real thing. And in the idea of somewhat inhabiting the space of the perpetrators, this allowed students to move from the simple good person, bad person, to question what really happened. But also not the what, because you can read the what, the why. Why does a neighbor rise against another neighbor, right? And that trip allowed students to do that. For all of those students, to this day, they'll send an email because they remembered something, and we're kind of going along email chain about this, right? But that was the beauty of this particular trip. That it allowed them to feel, see, smell, touch, right? But also talk to people, which they hadn't gotten before. And that changed how they approach these types of topics.
Thank you, James. I think all of you have said something that speaks to the slogan that we had made for the minor in peace and conflict studies, and for students who are here. It's a cross-university minor where you get to work with terrific faculty like those we have on the stage today. But the slogan that we came to was study war, make peace. Because there is this element of needing to understand, explain in order to be able to think about the next steps. We've got lots of tough questions here. And this is going to be a rapid, go kind of thing with these questions. I'll open this, and whoever wants to take it, whoever's quickest gets the question. What weight does quote unquote global peace bear on those who hold power in core countries? So we did get a few questions in advance too about this question of power, peace and power, how those things go together. But here's this question too about like global peace and how that matters to kind of core countries, the most powerful countries. Everyone's looking at Mike.
I'm too much of a cynic, so let's.
Well, one thing, I'm not sure that I totally understand the question, but one thing I would say is that in every situation that I've been involved in, whether it's Central America, South Africa, Northern Ireland, the country, the country with the greatest power, the entity with the greatest power, has to be the first mover and has to be willing to do things that their own population's not going to be crazy about. That's the dissolution of the Royal Ulster Constabulary. John Major took a huge risk. His own population didn't like it. Protestants in Northern Ireland didn't like it. It was the right thing to do, but he took a risk. Right. And in every situation, that has to be. De Klerk in South Africa, again, I'm not a big fan, but at the end of the day, they gave up power.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have another question. This one's about educators. So I'll look to the faculty who teach on this topic perhaps most often. How can educators navigate potential for bias when discussing sensitive and politically charged topics related to conflict? James and Cyrus, you're nodding. Who's going to take it?
Before I begin these conversations with my students, I explain to them what my background is. And I say, this then means I am likely to have a blind spot. But I'm also very honest with my students at the beginning of the semester, at the beginning of every class, to remind them that I grew up in an African country. I don't know much about what happens in the US apart from intellectually, but I've been on the receiving end of a lot of American policies that I was unhappy with. And I have to allow my students, this is not a thing you do when the class started. You create an environment in the class where students can bring up these and they feel safe enough to debate while realizing that they're not necessarily fighting each other. But that's a thing you have to create throughout the semester in the lead up to the tough conversations. So the tough conversations in my class only happen in the second half of class, once they know each other, once they're a bit friendly, and once we've created a level of committee within the class.
Thank you, James. Cyrus, do you want to add anything?
Sure. I mean, the courses I teach, the course that I teach for undergrads, for example, is one that follows what I call a problem-driven methodology. And so the idea here is that, it's okay, and it's in fact necessary to do well in my course to come in with, certain normative and moral commitments and things that you're pursuing. And what I ask is that, people articulate that those commitments in terms of problem definitions that they can then persuade people are relevant both in terms of normative and sort of like analytical argument, but then also empirically. And I push people to think about like how empirically and especially quantitatively you can go about characterizing and demonstrating the extent and relevance of the problem. And so I guess the way I try and deal with it is I say, okay, yeah, use these moral commitments in order to inform your problem statement, but then, generate a rigorous, like analytical, explanation or motivation for the problem, and then demonstrate to us empirically what's going on. As long as you're using the method, then it's all good, and then we follow from there in trying to use, social scientific methodology to unpack and understand the mechanisms that drive the problem. So I think, like in the way I address this issue is by trying to provide people with the analytical and methodological tools that they can use to convey the problem in a convincing manner.
Yeah, thank you. Josh, you were nodding. Did you want to get in on this question, or you're on the hot seat for the next one?
Okay.
Next one?
Next one.
Okay. This is a question about disciplines. So how are your disciplines connected to one another? Or I wonder if we might also ask sort of like, what is the value of interdisciplinarity, multidisciplinarity in trying to tackle questions of conflict and peace?
Sure. Well, I was going to say that's a real softball compared to the last question, so I think I made the right choice there. I mean, in terms of, it's been a really interesting, Elisabeth mentioned at the beginning that, I started off doing work that was very firmly rooted in political science as someone who does comparative political behavior. And then because of things that happened that I wanted to understand in the world around the emergence of social media as something that I thought was influencing people's participation in politics and I thought was becoming increasingly relevant, it moved me into this study of social media, which then actually took me into much greater contact with other disciplines than I had ever had before. There was also a kind of technological revolution that was going on, which is that computing power was increasing tremendously, which was simultaneously increasing the amount of data that was available that human beings were producing that you could analyze as a social scientist, and changing the types of tools that you could use to do this kind of analysis. And so all of these things combined to put me in a position where I've gotten to later in my career now, where I work with people who are communication scholars, who are computer scientists, who are psychologists, sociologists, economists, psychologists. So it's been really interesting. So I think it's a great question to ask, because I think that this is something that we as the academy and we as a university need to keep wrestling with, because we have this long-standing tradition, especially in arts and sciences, of where everything is organized around departments. And there are really good reasons why we are organized around departments. And I think I had the great honor, I was chosen to lead a sort of a group of 30 people who were doing an evaluation for future directions in the social sciences. And what we were supposed to consider was how interdisciplinary work could be encouraged, and what were the barriers to interdisciplinary work. And I think the reason why disciplines are so powerful is because they teach us, as Cyrus was saying, a kind of shared understanding of what is scientifically valid, what it means to make a scientific argument within disciplines. And disciplines, you get training within them. But I think we're entering a period of time where there's more and more research questions that just need to be answered at the boundaries of these different disciplines. And so, as I feel personally, the most exciting research is going on at the intersection of these disciplines, but we live in institutions that still give a tremendous amount of privilege to these disciplines. It's really, this is a thing I constantly try to raise with people around here. It's like, okay, so how do we deal with that? How do we move forward in a world where we harness all the possibilities of these interdisciplinary collaborations with these institutions that still give a lot of power to disciplines over the careers of academics, over the ways we do hiring, over the ways we do promotion, over the ways we do publication in many cases. And so it's been a really interesting thing to kind of watch. And in my field, in this field of what I would call the digital information environment, I think that's a huge issue. I'm interested to hear from my colleagues the extent to which that's an interest in the peace building field as well.
Yeah. Thank you. And I hope that you'll all agree that by having folks here who have different geographic expertise, different disciplinary experience and approaches, it has been a richer conversation, right? Speaking to your point, Josh. Now, I could do the easy thing, say it's 7:09, let's end on that softball, but that is not the spirit of this evening. And some of you with the bright lights, I can't read the cards, but here's one I can read. This is no softball. What's the difference between peace and justice? Do you want to give it a go, Mike?
Sure. I would say, I'm sorry, there are a number of values, a number of attributes of a healthy society that are essential to have a lasting peace. Justice is right in the middle of that. Dignity, sense of equality and fairness. So justice is a component part of building a society that's going to be actually able to achieve peace in a meaningful way.
Thank you.
Can I jump one thing on that?
Please.
Yeah, I think this goes back to my opening remarks about what's happening in Ukraine, and this is the fundamental crux of the matter. A world where Russia occupies Ukrainian territory and continues to do the types of things on those territories where it has been doing over the course of this world is not a just world. It is not clear that there's a world where we get with peace anytime soon that doesn't involve Russia holding Ukrainian territory. And these two fundamental values, both of which are incredibly important, justice and peace, in this case, may not be compatible with each other.
Thank you. James wants to get in on this one.
Yeah, I was going to say, the first time I interacted with this difference was reading a letter from MLK Jr. while he's at Birmingham jails. And one of the things he says is one of the most frustrating things for him were the liberals who were more interested in peace rather than justice, which then meant that they were less likely to push for the rights of African Americans and ensure African Americans were treated as citizens and human beings because of that preference for peace, right? So to echo, justice is this thing that is more of a tool and a vehicle towards peace, and it allows people to kind of go, if Cyrus does something wrong to me, I don't have to, I'm sorry for using this example, I don't have to chop his head off because I know there's a mechanism that will repair this problem, this ill, right? And that for me is a fundamental thing. So you could have this notion of peace, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's a just society in and of itself.
Please, Cyrus.
I guess, yeah, certainly there are ways of, ending violence and ensuring some version of peace that, amount to, repression, and those would obviously be contrary to justice. But there are also more challenging circumstances, and to go back to a theme that I've been discussing, like in many of the contexts in which I've been working, the idea that, former perpetrators of violence are just welcome back into society and operating is seen by many, as a massive injustice. And so how do we deal with that? I think that, discussions are, discourse about justice. There are certain facts that contribute to that, and I think that serve as important, pieces to the construction of a notion of justice. But then, there are also, points of view, narrative, and sort of frameworks, moral frameworks, and the construction of these moral frameworks that can reconcile difficult things like, the fact that people who perpetrated, violence can be allowed to live freely. coming up with the moral framework through which, that is acceptable, right? That's difficult work. But if you think about like the heroic actors that have served to help societies, move past, periods of conflict and injustice into new periods, a lot of what they do is actually constructing, moral frameworks that reconcile this in people's minds, So it's not to say, justice is all in your mind. Like, there are facts that constrain all of this, but I don't think that we should downplay the important intellectual work that, these, that people do to come up with moral frameworks that allow us to reconcile this in our mind, and then to see, some sort of settlement as the basis for moving forward.
Thank you, Cyrus. As we come to a close, and I look at all the notes that I've taken successfully on the iPad for the first panel, I kept writing things along the lines of what I promised, right? That this would illuminate complexity, right? And nuance. It would be challenging. And I also wrote this note to myself that I'm thinking as I'm listening to each of you more in a both and than an either or, right? Which was often how we position. It's this or it's this. But what we're hearing a lot about in peace and conflict, it's multiple things at the same time, and asking us to make sense of them in this environment of higher education where we have the privilege to do so. So I set out the goals at the beginning that you would learn something. I certainly did, and I'm so grateful to the panelists for helping us through that journey to doing so. I set out the goal that we would leave a little more unsure of our positions than when we came in. I hope you'll agree with me. I also feel that to be true on a number of the things that I learned tonight. And to leave with a new question. And I leave with many of my own and of yours. And I hope that we'll have the chance to continue this conversation, which I know, Christy, is just a start to many things that you're doing around the university. Thank you all. Thank you all so much also.
So join me. First, I want to thank Elisabeth for agreeing to moderate, and the panelists, Mike, Josh, Cyrus, James, for agreeing to come together in what looked like disparate types of conflict and disparate types of disciplines that I think the audience, I think, would agree with me, that came together in a really cohesive discussion and dialogue. So thank you. You said you wanted us to learn something. You wanted us to be more unsure, have a question. I have one more thing that happened to me. I'd like you guys to stick around for like another hour and continue to talk, because what you're doing is such interesting work, and your passion for it and the knowledge that each discipline brings to this idea of peace and conflict and how do we look forward is really, really something. So again, one more time. And I want to, and thank you for those that joined on live stream. This is our second event for NYU in Dialogue. We will have all of the recordings up online. So if your friends didn't come, if you say, hey, they really talked about something great I want to share, you'll be able to do that. So please check back to the NYU in Dialogue website. So as we upload the live streams into recorded content, totally share it. And then also we're getting ready to go on spring break. But and you'll get some information while you're on spring break if you're a student or a faculty. Our next event is the Monday you come back from spring break. That would be Monday, March 25th. It's in Skirball, and it's David Green, who was a former host of Morning Edition on NPR, and he moderates a podcast, and he's very passionate about the ideas of left, right, and center, and hearing multiple perspectives. So he's going to be in dialogue with someone from StoryCorps, who started One Small Step, and a Trump and Biden supporter. So again, in line with this in dialogue, multiple perspectives, understanding perspectives that are different, complex, more nuanced. It's not as simple as a right, wrong, bad guy, good guy. We really encourage you to come out on March 25th as well in Skirball. And you can register for that online. So again, thank you.
Thank you for having me.